Good evening, everyone, and it's very nice to be out of the old people's home on a Thursday. Normally I do the bingo calling on Thursday evening, so if I start shouting out numbers like two little ducks and all this sort of stuff, you'll forgive me. It's that I've just got a bit confused. And talking about being confused, I think the Bribery Act of 2010 and the guidelines are extremely confused. And I'd like to talk for a little while on these subjects. First of all, a little rant about the Bribery Act and what effect it's going to have in practice. Secondly, on the Ministry of Justice guidance, which has been issued supposedly to help us, or to help corporates, as the Serious Fraud Office calls them, but they're actually companies, how they can comply and produce adequate procedures to comply and discharge their potential liabilities under Section 7 of the Act. And the UK, I think, is probably exceptional. I can't find any other country in the world that applies domestic punishment in the UK for bribery overseas in the private market. I'm not aware of any act anywhere that does. And I'm not aware of any country that's gone quite as far as the UK in criminalising facilitation payments. And we'll talk about the guidance and what we can do about it. The final sort of part of my talk, which I hope will be the helpful bit, is to look at what we can do in terms of risk evaluation, how we can really understand what risks we're facing, because I certainly agree with the Ministry of Justice that that is the starting point of getting controls in place and subscribing to the K2 philosophy of being the first to know. Just a couple of things about my background. A lot of things that Jules has said is true, of course, but there are other things that aren't true. I've been in the anti-fraud business, I might emphasize, rather than doing it, for something like 40 years, initially with the Customs and Excise Investigation Branch, and then as security advisor for Esso Petroleum and then Esso Europe. And one of the jobs I had was looking after the North Sea oil investment of Esso, Shell and BP. And it didn't hit the press at the time, but the sort of losses we were getting from corruption and overcharging we were getting from corruption was probably running in the range of 15 to 20% overall. Massive corruption, and there was little that we could do about some of that because it was urgent to get these production lines on operating and on stream, and therefore interrupting by arresting people and doing other nasty things wasn't something that was particularly encouraged. But the level of corruption was massive. And one of the problems about when you talk about corruption is that you tend to think of the cases as being historic, that what was happening 10, 15 years ago isn't happening now. And so I think we discount and underestimate what is currently happening in terms of worldwide corruption, and also especially in the UK, which is where I'm based. I was also fortunate enough to be an advisor on a number of corruption assignments, the main one probably with the government of Jamaica when Michael Manley came in as Prime Minister. And we were called in there initially by the British government to advise on how to try to cut out corruption and problems within that department. I also worked for the Brunei anti-corruption teams, the Indonesian teams, Malaysian, and the two other countries I worked for that I'd rather not talk about for confidentiality reasons, because I want to talk about what really happens inside some of these corrupt regimes. And I'm going to talk about a theoretical customs department. I'm not pointing fingers at any one particular department, but I'm just talking about a method of operation that puts into perspective the Ministry of Justice guidance on facilitation payments, on paying small amounts to government officials to get them to do the job they should be doing anyway. And what typically happens, if you take a sort of typical corrupt customs department, is that at the very top levels, at the government levels, at the ministry levels, it is well known that the customs officers are paid well below sub-survival wages. They are not paid enough to live on. And that's known, and it's condoned, and it's accepted, and it's also accepted that the customs officers will make up the shortfall by tips and perks and bribes, and by being, as they say, entrepreneurial, i.e. being corrupt. It's known, it's absolutely accepted that that's the case. Within those hierarchies, there are two sorts of jobs. There are wet jobs, and the wet jobs are those jobs where the officers concerned are facing members of the public or they're facing commercial enterprises, and they can extort money from those enterprises to make up the shortfall that they're meeting in their normal salaries. And it's implicit in a wet job that you share your proceeds with people who are in dry jobs, who don't have the outward-facing characteristics and are not able to get and extort bribes from third parties. The degree of formality and the arrangements between the wet jobs and dry jobs varies across those organizations I've shown on my chart, but the general sort of principle, the sort of thing you see, for example, in one of these countries, was that on a Friday afternoon, the senior customs officers would meet either in the Presidential Golf Club or in a local five-star hotel. And they would reconcile the amount of money that had been taken in the wet jobs in the previous week. And they'd make sure that those monies were allocated up the chain, right up the chain, to those people in dry jobs and shared out properly. That was the first task. The second task was to look at what transportation was taking place in the country in the coming week. That would be aircraft arrivals, ship arrivals, whatever happened to be, maybe some warehouse movements. And each of the senior officers was able to bid, to make a bid to handle that particular cargo or that particular consignment. And the bid for a roll-on, roll-off large vessel could go to up to $100,000. And if the guy was successful, the supervisor was successful in getting the bid, then he would have to account the following week for the $100,000. But if he happened to make $200,000 for his team, then he kept the $100,000 for his team and they shared it out. And junior officers were always very keen to work for senior officers who were good bidders, because they then shared very much in the proceeds and the benefits of what took place. Within specialist teams, you would find, within some of the customs department, you might find 2 or 3 supervisors who were specialists in handling certain cargoes. Some might be specialists at handling a type of commodity. And another one might also be specialist in handling that commodity. And you would find that they would bribe each other not to bid for the main contract. And so you had the bribery within the bribery to get this allocation. Now, every customs officer that was involved in this, and they were all involved in it because they had to be involved in it, if they didn't meet their targets of what they were to collect during the following week, then the assumption would be by their colleagues that they'd stolen the money. And it was not unusual to find customs officers beaten to a pulp or even killed because they didn't collect the value money, that's the term that was used for this, that they were due to collect. Another thing to note about these departments is, at these meetings, they would also look at the ship arrivals for the coming week, look at the manifests, what cargoes were on these vessels or aircraft, and if they were really attractive cargoes, they would act as information brokers and tell the local hijacking gangs, oh, there's a consignment of computer chips coming in on container number so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and so. And they would get a very handsome reward from these criminal gangs for giving this information. Unfortunately, the organization of this aspect of their work was not quite as good as some of the other stuff, and very often different officers would tip off different gangs, all taking a kickback. On one occasion, there was one truck of computer parts that was hijacked 3 times on one journey. It left the port, it was hijacked, and so on. And then you had the connection of the customs guys to the major narcotics and people smuggling, to heavyweight organized crime. Now, I mention all this to put in context, the SFO idea that you mustn't give a customs officer a Homer Simpson mouse mat at Christmas because you'll corrupt him. The fact of the matter is that the corruption very often is so heavily ingrained and backed by organized crime that whatever we do in the West isn't going to make the slightest difference at all to what goes on in these departments. There are exceptions, and there are many, many guys working for these departments who are honest, but have no option but to subscribe to the corrupt performance to save their own skins. But that is the level of corruption that takes place, in my experience, in the real world. And it's very serious, and it puts into context what we must do if we want to try and comply with the most strict interpretations of the Bribery Act, how we must approach these overseas government agencies that employ foreign public officials. It's no use going along shouting and screaming and saying you must do this and do that, because it just isn't going to work. And from my experience of working with these departments, there is a massive built-in resistance to being told by the white man what you will do and not do. These guys have got completely different cultures, and we haven't got any right to go along and demand that they do it in a certain way. And so we have the conflict of basically on one side quite heavyweight corruption, and on the other a very, very tough regulatory regime in the UK that stops us dealing with facilitation payments, or at least makes it very difficult to deal with that problem. The problem for honest companies, let's just have a look at what I think the problems are with the Bribery Act. First of all, as Jules touched on, the competitive corruption, especially in the private sector overseas. Now, I'm not suggesting under any circumstances that British companies get involved in grand corruption and start paying massive bribes, as in the Siemens case and other cases that we've seen in British aerospace and so on. I think those cases are dreadful, and I don't think there should be any sympathy for these people. I don't think, for example, in those cases, the regulators should settle those cases civilly. If somebody gets involved in that level of corruption, if an individual does, he or she should go to prison. There should be no exceptions. And under the UK law, as you all know, I'm sure, there is the potential to permanently debar companies from businesses that get into that business, get into corruption. And those debarment conditions, I believe, should be invoked. You should not have a company that's too big to fail. If a company's senior management has got involved in grand corruption, there is no reason why the director should not go to prison and why the company should not be debarred from government business. I don't think anything short of that really works. The problem that isn't really addressed very much in the guidance or in the Act is incoming corruption. And by that I mean where your own employees are bribed, where they take bribes to make a decision on behalf or in favor of a third party. So those are the two things that I think in risk assessment we should be looking at, besides simple compliance with Section 7 and the adequate procedures. But the real problem is, in my experience in talking to companies that are involved in this area, is the uncertainty that the Act creates for things like hospitality payments, sponsorship, marketing support schemes, and facilitation payments we've just talked about. Because companies just don't seem to know where they stand. It's no use the regulators saying, well, we'll judge the cases with the benefit of hindsight using prosecutorial discretion. It doesn't give you the level of certainty you need in making decisions on what is acceptable and what is not. And because of that, I think it's going to result in British companies playing it so safe that they are, in terms of hospitality and marketing and so on, that they actually do not succeed in overseas markets. And that's maybe, I don't know, if that happens, we British companies or Western companies pull out of certain corrupt countries because they can't compete, and what happens? Well, the first thing that happens is the Chinese, the Koreans, the Taiwanese, and other countries whose companies are not bound by the same sort of draconian legislation as we are, step right in. The president of Gabon was complaining the other day that all of a sudden the Western companies have pulled out of his country, they won't compete there, and he's finding the prices are being pushed up by the Chinese and everything else, and they're at a serious disadvantage. These Chinese organizations are working in a market where they basically have a monopoly. And therefore I don't think it helps companies, or helps countries rather, that the Western companies pull out because of draconian laws at home. There needs to be a balance struck that takes a realistic approach, and I absolutely agree with what Jules says. This level of corruption, whether it's at home or overseas, isn't going to change overnight. It's a 20-year, maybe even a 2-generation change, even if we're lucky. But we should be working towards that. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't, but we should. When the Bribery Act went through, eventually went through Parliament as one of the last acts in fact it was the last act that the last Labour government passed, there was a great deal of chest thumping and patting on the back by especially my great friend Jack Straw, who was saying how great it was that Britain was leading the way, that we were showing an example to these sort of third world countries on how to behave it properly, and we were patting ourselves on the back. What a great job we'd done. We were basically self-flagellating on how good we were, and of course the idea was that if we did this, then all these other countries would follow suit. Well, there's only one response to that, and that's dreaming Technicolor, because it's just not going to happen in that way at all. And as far as being Britain leading the way in anti-corruption laws, it's absolute nonsense. If you look at the World Bank list of banned companies, currently on the banned company list, there is 175 banned companies. Now, where do they come from? Do they come from the corrupt countries like Indonesia, Brazil, China? No. 38 of them come from the UK. We are the biggest subscriber to the World Bank banned companies list. So I don't think we've got a lot to pat ourselves on the back about. And I think that what we're doing with the Act is very much a cosmetic and a spin that's not going to make a great deal of difference. On the other hand, there are things that we can do, and we'll come on to those. The one thing I do agree with the Minister of Justice on is the importance of risk assessment. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever been involved or are involved in risk assessment, but it's a wonderful study. The International Standards Organization has currently 80 study groups and committees looking at risk analysis. 80 of the little buggers, all leaping about, scratching their heads, seeing how they can look into the future. And the Ministry of Justice guidelines, or guidance, comes out and it has 500 words on how you do this. How you set the sort of, if you like, the problem, how you define the problem that everything else you're going to do will be constructed upon. 500 words, 80 committees. I think it's a slight underplaying of the position. And what it says is that you should do this risk analysis and you should then have proportionate controls. And so it says, how do you analyze the risk? Well, it does a lot of waffling about. And this is the first thing you do is country risk. It depends on the countries you're operating in. And we see lots of companies that take this Transparency International list of the most corrupt countries. And it's a list produced by Transparency International, a non-governmental organization, that currently has something like 180 countries listed in terms of perceived corruption. Now, I don't know about you, but perception seems to me to be a fairly erratic sort of way of measuring anything. And it's a little bit ironic, too, that those countries that are perceived to be the most honest tend to have pretty bad weather, and they eat lots of pickled fish. But there may be a deeper analysis to this than I've already seen. I may have missed a point, I'm not really sure. But the point, whether you accept this or not, is that the Ministry of Justice says that you divide this list, you make it proportionate. So if you make it proportionate, it means you must divide the list into some segments. You must divide it probably maybe between high-risk countries and low-risk countries. Or maybe if you're going to be a bit sophisticated, you divide it into 3, high risk, medium risk, and low risk. So at some point you have to divide this list. Now, do you divide it between the 50th country and the 51st country? Or the 51st and the 52nd? Or the 71st? Where do you divide the list? Because where you divide it will make a difference on whether you categorize that company as high risk or low risk or medium risk. Now, if you divide the list where I would divide it, you actually get a division between Swaziland and Burkina Faso. So Swaziland goes in the medium category, and Burkina goes in the higher category. And you build your controls as proportionate around that. Now, anyone who thinks that's a successful way of doing it can buy me a drink when we break up. The second thing that's important in that is that the Ministry of Justice guidelines talk very much about red flags, that you look for red flags, you look for intermediates and agents and others who do dodgy things, who ask for commissions in advance, or who ask for excessive commissions. And you focus your attention on these dodgy devils that ask for this sort of stuff. Now, if you're going to be involved in continued corruption, if you're going to carry on irrespective of the Act, the one thing you'll make sure you don't do is trigger a red flag. Looking for red flags is looking for a dodo. It's not going to do the slightest good at all to anybody that's got any sense. You might catch a few dummies, but you're not going to catch anybody that's got any sense, because they're going to go a completely different route. And the thing about this is that risk analysis or risk assessment has to be anticipatory. It has to look forward and has to try and predict as best you can what will happen in the future, not what has been the historic pattern of misbehavior, but what is the future pattern going to be? How is it going to work in the future? And how can you predict where those risks are? So, on the risk assessment side, I think there are some problems. On the control side, one of the classic controls in the Ministry of Justice guidelines is that you have and take into account the tone from the top. That the tone from the top is a very important thing, and that sort of percolates down the organization as setting the scene and setting the standards for others. Now, certainly by having a policy on ethics and so on, I certainly subscribe to, but do not believe it sprinkles down like fairy magic dust to all of the people below. What is very important is what is the tone in individual contexts. It's in individual contexts where key decisions are taken that can be corrupted. And it's there that I believe the risk analysis should focus, not on throwing this massive blanket out on tone from the top. On due diligence, another control that's recommended as a heavy sort of weight thing by the Ministry of Justice. The example we give is of the Christmas turkey. From the 1st of January until the 20th of December, the turkey was very, very happy with Farmer Giles. He thought Farmer Giles fed him and looked after him and took him walks and generally nurtured him. On the 23rd of December, the situation changed. And that's the problem with due diligence. It is a snapshot in time that gives you no great continuation through. Now, in fairness to the Ministry of Justice, they recognize the one-shot nature of due diligence. And I'm not suggesting you don't do it, because you must. But they're arguing, and I agree, that there must be a form of monitoring. But the way you monitor the third parties you're dealing with is very important. The way the justice guidelines come through is that you take the third parties you deal with and you basically don't trust them. That you're looking over their shoulder in a sort of critical adversarial sort of way and seeing if they're doing what they should be doing. And I think that's the wrong way to go. I think the whole problem with regulation is that it gets effected through fear and punishment and suspicion, whereas in relationships in a commercial sense, you want collaboration, working together, mutual support, and certainly you want to detect cases where it's going wrong, but immediately you tell someone, I don't trust you, I'm going to do business with you, but I don't trust the single thing you're doing. I think that's a very destructive way of doing business. And therefore, we're talking about very much a more collaborative relationship with third parties, with agents and intermediaries, and so on. And finally, on this point, on whistleblowing, a great emphasis has been placed on how important it is to have, and I hate the term whistleblowing, but to have reporting lines, hotlines in place where employees especially can report suspected violations and get them dealt with. The first thing is that if you do have a whistleblowing procedures, which I think you should have, it applies not just to employees but to third parties, to intermediaries, to customer suppliers, into a much wider population than just employees. And the problem with whistleblowing is it completely overlooks the nature of collusion. If you're involved in a corrupt relationship with a third party, sure as heck you're going to keep it pretty confidential. You're not going to broadcast that you're up to this skullduggery with somebody else, and so it's held tightly. The people who know about corruption, generally speaking, are those who are directly involved in it, or are related so closely to it that you can't see any light between them. And so the art of whistleblowing, the art of getting reporting procedures in place that really work, is to try to fragment collusive groups, to break away people who are involved in the collusion and get them to blow the whistle on their conspirators. And that's a different sort of problem altogether than just having a line that somebody can phone in. We maintain a hotline for a very large Gulf state company, and we get everything comes in to that through the internet or through hotlines. 95% of things that come on that hotline are employee relations matters. They're nothing to do with fraud. Most of them, a complete waste of time. They're bad people. You've got to try and break up collusive groups. Now, one of the interesting things that's going to happen in the next sort of coming months is the new legislation in the States, which is the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Act, Wall Street Reform Act. And that, for the first time, is allowing the SEC to pay rewards of up to 30% for information that leads to the exposure of security violations, including the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And therefore, people, I think, are going to use the Dodd-Wall Street procedure, Dodd-Frank, to report, as they're called, a first instance, suspected bribery cases involving both UK and American companies. And I think that there will be quite a reaction to that, and that it puts an enormous pressure, I think, on corporate whistleblowing procedures, because people who are in the know, rather than report to you, will report directly to the regulator. And one of the principles of this first-to-know approach is that you don't want the regulators turning up on your doorstep one morning with an arrest warrant, a search warrant, Section 2 order. If that happens, then your system has definitely failed. And first-to-know is one of the reasons for getting around that. Okay. Let's have a look at what we mean by risk analysis. We're suggesting that companies get involved in 5 levels of risk analysis. First of all, the acts of bribery themselves. And these are incoming bribery, outgoing bribery, competitive bribery. And this is the part, if you like, a slight extension over the Ministry of Justice guidance. The second level of risk assessment is the discovery risk. What is the chance of the regulator picking a case up, especially about van bribery, before you? What is the chance of this not coming on your door at 6 o'clock in the morning? And it depends a great deal on what your controls are, what your position is on the regulatory radar. But to understand what the discovery risk is, because if you are in an industry or sector where the discovery risk is going to be high because the regulators are concentrating on that, or it's one that might be involved in the Dodd-Frank Act or whatever, you've got to watch out. One of the areas that I believe is extremely important is the investigatory risk. Because once you've got the symptoms come to light of a bribery case, you have the right, under the Act or under the guidance, to conduct an investigation internally before you decide whether or not to report it to the regulators. And the way you conduct that investigation is critical. You do not want to make matters worse by sweeping stuff under the rug, or by a botched-up investigation, or by pretending that you've solved the case and there's no case to answer, and not reporting, and then finding 6 weeks later the regulators pick it up and it's a massive case that you swept under the rug. You are now in serious trouble. And so, who handles the investigations in your organization? What qualifications do they have? What procedures do they have? Do they understand what sort of protection you might get through privilege? What sort of help they might get from the SFO or regulators if it concerns competitive bribery? I mean, the whole area of investigation planning, contingency planning, is, I believe, very important, and almost, in some ways, more important, or equally as important, as assessing the primary bribery risk. And then the reporting risks. The Bribery Act does not require anyone to report violations to the regulators. You do not have to pick up and say, look, we've had this terrible trouble. But the SFO has made it very clear if you don't voluntarily report, they'll be after your hide. And yet the attractiveness of reporting to the SFO can be sometimes quite difficult to see. That they're going to publicise it, they're going to sort of beat you to a pulp. And if you look at the settlements that have taken place, especially in America, which is adopting a similar sort, where the SFO is adopting a similar sort of approach, the actual civil settlements, or the civil disposals, and the penalties involved in those, are on average 7 times the amount of gross revenue generated by the alleged bribery. It's not a particularly attractive payoff at the end of the day, but it may well be, and I'm not saying it's entirely a matter of policy what your company's position is on reporting or not. Yeah, just one question, one final thing on risk analysis. What we're arguing, or what we're suggesting, is to try to form your primary risk analysis on this idea of decision centricity. That it's not a question of looking at country risk, it's not a question of looking at red flags, it's trying to identify where in your organization decisions are taken that could be influenced by corruption. To really understand the individual context, maybe in purchasing departments, sales departments, incoming and outgoing bribery, and to really drill down into those areas and identify the decisions. So on that point, Charlie didn't tell you that he's put this speaking stand over the trap door in the stage. And if you go over, if you overrun, he presses the button. So thank you very much for your attention. If anyone's got any questions, we'll see you, I'm sure, at drinks time. Thank you very much.